Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we will be talking about another world of the Imperium, Feudal worlds. Not to be mistaken for night worlds, mind you, as whilst pretty much all night worlds, with the exception of those run by the Mechanicus, of course, are feudal worlds, that does not mean that all feudal worlds are night worlds. In fact, if they were, the Imperium would probably be a much happier place. Or at the very least, significantly better defended. A feudal world is generally speaking defined by two things. The first is the existence of a very strict and usually hereditary hierarchy on nearly all levels of society. So it isn't just the feudal ruler, the planetary governor, and his various lords beneath him, but rather every family, every profession, every element and facet of civil, military, and official society is usually in some way or form hereditary, with fathers teaching their sons their craft and raising them to take over when they are gone. This is not an absolute ironclad rule in all cases, as there are feudal worlds with significantly more social mobility. There are feudal worlds in which mere peasants can distinguish themselves via acts of military valor, for example, skill at arms, or particular knack for certain things. But generally speaking, a feudal world will be highly hierarchical. And the second defining factor is what gives them their real flavor, their lack of high imperial technology. Generally speaking, the feudal worlds are at a level, and often kept at the level, of roughly early to high medieval Europe to the very beginnings of the Renaissance. And there can be many reasons for this, and there can be many reasons for why it is continued or discontinued or kept only in certain elements. In fact, this might sound like a boring topic. A feudal world, what is it? Well, it's just a night world, it's just a bunch of Iron Age barbarians. Oh, no. Much like the Death worlds, there's a hell of a lot more to a feudal world than at first meets the eye. Let us begin with the technological aspect, shall we? Now, it is, of course, a fairly safe rule of thumb that the better your technology for producing something is, then the better the end result of producing that thing is likely to be. But here's the kicker. The Imperium's technology is actually garbage. As I'm sure most of you are painfully aware of at this point, the Imperium is somewhat backwards. And what technology it does possess tends to be utilitarian, rather than specialized. It tends to be rugged and effective at doing what it does, but it's not necessarily the best solution for it. It is, as we tend to say, a hammer. And if the only tool at your disposal is a hammer, then every problem had best be a nail. Oh, sure, by and large, the Imperium's technology for doing a thing will suffice for doing it. It might even be pretty damn good at it in certain instances, but very rarely, if ever, will it be the perfect solution. Apply this line of reason to agriculture, for example. Now, agri-worlds, as we've kind of talked about previously, can mean a whole bunch of things. They can be heavily mechanized, industrialized agri-worlds, functioning of hydroponics purely, or they can simply be enormous planets with huge open fields, or enormous dozens upon dozens of kilometers wide animal husbandry pastures. By and large, these will be growing the staple foodstuffs of the Imperium and tending to the needs of the staple husbandry animal of the Imperium, the grox. These are utilitarian things that Imperial technology is good enough, at least, to manage on a large scale. But what if we entertain the notion of an agri-world that grows things based upon local knowledge rather than this industrialized large-scale production knowledge? Say, for example, not an agri-world per se, but you've got a planet like Tarnith, for example, before it exploded. Tarnith was famous for creating a very particular kind of wood, which had a beautiful finish and was also very, very strong and long-lasting. The Imperium could not produce such a wood via its own mass production measures because its technology is focused around certain set staple types of wood. All of its industrial machinery is designed to harvest that type of wood. All of it is designed around planting that type of wood, and all of their procedures are focused around growing that type of wood. In this case, the only way you can create a large-scale production of gnarlwood is if the inhabitants of the planet grow it, harvest it, and ship it out themselves. And it isn't that the Imperium couldn't possibly do this itself, but it would be considered in almost all circumstances to simply just be an enormous waste of time and resources. If the Imperium was to exploit Tarnith for timber on a proper imperial scale, what they would do is land enormous earth movers, bulldoze everything, and I do mean everything, and then move down their own sowing apparatus and plant tree after tree after tree at precisely equal distances from the other trees until damn near the entire planet is one enormous, pre-planned and laid out lumberyard. In fact, there are examples of this in the lore of timber planets, where the population is constantly traveling. They chop down an area of woods, then they move on to the next one, then they chop down that area, then they move on to the next one, and they chop down that area, and so on, whilst the timber producing machines turning the raw timber into planks, etc., or whatever else they're making, follow behind them, pick up the timber, process it, pop it onto the spaceport, send it up to orbit, and the population simply goes around the planet like an enormous corn cob, as by the time they arrive at the other end again, the trees will have grown. So in front of them, they always have trees, and behind of them, they've always got clear cuts. In an endless cycle, only occasionally interrupted by catastrophic forest fires, one would assume. And the Imperium does this because its need for resources is titanic, to the point that doing it any other way is just not really going to be logical for a major investment in that resource. But there is always exceptions, of course. Gnarlwood might not be able to be exported on a massive basis, but it can still create an entire planet's worth of export of this luxury good. And of course, there is always a demand for luxury goods in any system, just like there will always be a demand for quality vegetables, quality foodstuffs from agri-worlds that might be able to also be relatively efficient in their own way. Sure, a feudal world, no matter how productive, will never match the industrial output of a major industrialized agri-world, but it will also consume a billionth of the resources, as the overwhelming majority of agri-worlds tend to be near entirely self-sufficient. It can continue to create food or timber or whatever else it is producing indefinitely from its own production. You don't need to set up an enormous logistical system to supply it. You don't need to ship off millions upon millions of gallons of promethium to fuel the enormous industrial machinery. There's just animals and peoples and whatever locally produced industrial equipment they've got down on the planet. It is, in essence, a net gain for the Imperium, for, well, literally, in many cases, no expense whatsoever. And sure, again, its output will be limited, but gaining something for nothing? Well, it's usually a pretty damn good deal. Even more so if this something can be specialized to the planet. Again, I mentioned staple foodstuff and animals like the grox. Well, an agri-world might not be suited for this particular thing, in which case the Imperium will go in and terraform it to make it suitable. Whereas an agri-world, well, it'll grow whatever it's always been growing. If its local climate and temperature and distance from the sun, yada yada yada, is particularly good for growing bananas, to take an example, then the world is going to produce ridiculous quantities of bananas. If it's good for a form of cereal, then that's what they're going to produce. If it is good for a certain form of livestock, then that is what it's going to produce, allowing the planet to, again, without additional imperial investment, produce as close to its natural cap of resources as feasible, for the simple reason that the people who have lived there for the last 2,000 years have at this point got a pretty good grasp on how to grow bananas. And they will also be exceptional and valuable planets that might have the correct temperature, atmosphere, or God only knows what, to produce unique things like the gnarlwood, for example, a better, tougher timber. Fantastic. What if a planet has access to a certain cereal that just grows really goddamn fast? Well, that'd be fantastic, but it requires very specific soil compositions for it to actually grow at that speed. Well, the Imperium could try to replicate those precise soil conditions in other places, and I'm sure that many Adeptus biologists will try to do so. But again, the Imperium takes a very goddamn long time to do anything. And in the meantime, you might as well just have the planet produce cereal to feed surrounding worlds. You might also have planets that are host to unique creatures. Think something like the silkworm, for example, that is capable of creating silk. The silkworm industry was enormous at one point, incidentally. In fact, it was one of the largest portions of the Japanese economy preceding the Second World War, when America started to starve them out because, well, they didn't like them invading China and such on nonsense. The silkworm is a rather fascinating little creature, and it creates a very, very fascinating substance. It wouldn't be stretching credibility too much then to imagine a planet that has a similarly fascinating creature, that, say, for example, creates a substance equivalent to Kevlar, pretty much. Well, you'd want to make sure that those things proliferate rather rapidly across as large an area of the planet as possible. But again, maybe they're fragile, as silkworms can tend to be, and raising them can be difficult. Well, you could try to industrialize it, but again, the Mechanicus would frankly be more likely to wipe out the species rather than properly exploit them, whereas the locals, again, they've been doing this for the last few thousand years. They've got it down, and you might as well let them just keep doing it. But fancy foodstuff and hypothetical creatures who create Kevlar from their buttholes are not the only benefits of an agri-world. Another is the aforementioned ability to be self-sustaining. This tends to result in planets with rather large populations, as one of the technological elements that the Imperium usually do introduce to these worlds is medicine. Again, the level of technology can vary drastically. Some worlds are kept deliberately at a relatively low level of technology for reasons of control, for example. Maybe it's way out of the way and it's simply just an effective agri-world where you're creating the super cereal, for example. Well, you don't really want to garrison it because it's way out of the way. It would be a complete waste. You don't really want to train people on the planet to defend themselves because it would be a waste of good farm hands. And you don't, again, really need to, but you do have to worry about uprising, of course, because if a chaos cult does sneak its way in there, well, shit. The entire sector might rely on this one food-producing world. Well, it would be excellent if a chaos cult did arise, if the best weaponry they had available were sharpened sticks and swords. It would make subduing the Chaos Cult a rather simple matter for nearby garrisons. That would be enormous benefit. Other worlds are granted elements of technology to benefit it. Say, for example, that it is a very effective agri-world. Okay, they might be given large harvesting machines by the Adeptus Mechanicus, and a small subservient class of adepts might be created on the planet specifically to operate these mass harvesters, which will in turn, in all due likelihood, soon be viewed as magical, mystical beasts of burden by the local populace, who sees the enormous rum and goes, wow, magic. any sufficiently advanced technology and all that. Or, alternatively, the planet could be allowed to keep on evolving at whatever pace it is evolving at, but be granted access to certain advantageous elements of Imperial technology, like, for example, a medicine, as we mentioned earlier. Because if you have a large world capable of sustaining a massive population, well, people is a resource that the Imperium is always in dire need of, and if you don't need to actively sustain that population via exports and imports of food, for example, even better. And the population numbers can obviously get rather massive. Consider a planet like ours, for example. If you introduce medicine that almost completely eradicates child death, and you get rid of the major epidemic diseases, the Black Death, the plague, etc., stuff like that, measles, then the population is likely to skyrocket. If the production of food is capable of keeping up with this, then fantastic. You might have a planet supporting several billion people, which is a lot of recruits for the Imperial Guard. And so you make sure that the local planetary governor has a yearly celebration, for example, where a big census is held, and everyone who fits criteria based on fitness or skill, or maybe even warrior tournaments, we'll get to that in a second as well, will be chosen to go into the sky, into heaven, beyond the stars, to fight for the God Emperor, or whatever local variation of the Imperial cult the planet is currently worshipping at the time. And then the Imperial Guard comes down in their enormous dropship, herds aboard a few 100 million people a year, and continue to feed the grinder with fresh, farm-grown flesh. And yes, that can be a primary export of a feudal world as well. Indeed, there are even feudal worlds who supply the Adeptus Astartes with recruits, though they tend to prefer something a pinch more savage. The slightly more organized structural hierarchy of a feudal world can actually be highly beneficial to producing strong, tough, and skilled warriors. As I mentioned previously with the hierarchy, a father teaching his son his arts and ways and crafts, etc., well, you can imagine that would be pretty gosh darn useful if you're trying to produce an effective crop of warriors. You could essentially think of a knight world, but without the, enormous mecha knights, traditional knights. Knightly households, martial brotherhoods, orders of experienced warriors, which train new generations, and the cream of the crop get to go to the stars and beyond to serve the God Emperor. An excellent example of a feudal world that produces tough fighting men en masse for the Imperial Guard is, of course, the world of Attila. Not the most creative of worlds. World names right there, but Attila creates, of course, you guessed it, cavalry. What other options were there, honestly? It creates the Attilan Rough Riders. Now, of course, one might immediately raise some questions as to the point and purpose of cavalry in the 41st millennium, and indeed, I did an entire video on that, a decade or so ago, I think. And essentially, it is a question of maneuverability. The Attilan Rough Riders can fight mounted, in which case they use explosive hunting lances. Essentially, it's a spear, but with a couple kilograms of shape-charged high explosives at the tip, allowing the Rough Riders to engage enemy armor and heavy infantry with relative efficiency. Of course, the problem is still reaching the enemy tank without getting cut to shreds by heavy machine gun fire, and, well, yeah, no, that is genuinely a problem. But by and large, the Rough Riders are not intended to actually be charging tank columns for obvious reasons. They are meant to be, well, partially shock infantry when the situation requires it, but also simply just mobile infantry. We had full-on cavalry regiments during the Second World War, but obviously they didn't actually fight mounted. They simply used the horses for mobility and then fought like regular infantry thereafter. That would be the use for the vast majority of Rough Rider regiments. With some exceptions, the Death Riders of Krieg, for example, well, first and foremost, getting cut to pieces by heavy machine guns, well, it's pretty much just the Death Guard of Krieg's staple, frankly. And whether they do so on foot or mounted on a horse matters relatively little. Plus, their horses are heavily modified to the point that a heavy bolt round isn't going to stop it. 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe is going to slow it. But to kill it, you're going to have to reach for the anti-tank weaponry. And if you are able to deploy massed formations of both horses and riders who don't give a fig about dying or being blasted apart, well, then enormous cavalry charges would probably be rather devastating, for the simple reason that a horse and a dude and a spear that explodes is a bit cheaper than a main battle tank and can thus be deployed in significantly larger quantities. But you do require a certain kind of individual to do this, which is why the Rough Rider regiments tend to be rather specialized. Of course, the ones from Attila are expert horsemen, and are able to conduct hit-and-run guerrilla tactic campaigns against enemies so as to avoid the whole charging down the barrel of a heavy machine gun problem. Whereas the Death Riders of Krieg, they'll just do so and smile, as they will be able to meet the God Emperor very, very soon. And other more traditional, modern-day mounted cavalry regiments would again simply be using the horses for mobility and logistical purposes, and presumably for the carrying of heavy weaponry. If you've got, for example, a rocket launcher, well, I imagine a horse could probably carry a fair few single-shot rocket launchers. You could definitely strap a heavy bolter to it and then take it off the horse, set it up, and then use that as a firing platform, allowing you to move significantly faster than infantry. By platform, I don't mean on the horse, by the way. I do mean take it off the horse and then set it up regularly, and it also allows a regiment to carry a great deal more supplies, food stuff, ammunition, etc., than one on foot, giving them a certain degree of logistical independence from the main supply trains of the Imperial Guard. There are, in fact, many benefits to a mounted regiment, both for cost-saving measures, mobility, and general flexibility, particularly on certain worlds that aren't very built up. Say, for example, that you are fighting on, well, a feudal world. It's probably not overly blessed with highways, and so enormous columns of trucks is going to have a hard time getting around, but horses, wagons, carts, well, it's literally the local mode of transportation, and the road network is going to be set up to facilitate just that. Like with all things, there is a role for even these more archaic warriors within the enormous Imperial war machine. Now, whether or not the bureaucracy of the Imperium will be able to deliver them to the correct battlefield, or simply dump them into a section of trench on Warworld, different topic. And it isn't all Rough Riders either, naturally. Whilst Attila is a world naturally predisposed to creating large formations of Rough Riders, because the entire population, well, with the exception of one city, that is, live a nomadic wandering lifestyle on their world. Other feudal worlds might simply have a warrior culture, as aforementioned knightly houses, for example, feudal warrior orders, or potentially things like the samurai, retainers, and loyal guards to large-scale farmers. You might, for example, have a system on a feudal world, an agricultural world, where individuals own vast stretches of farmland. Well, these vast stretches are obviously going to need workers, duh, but they're also going to need guards, as, well, we humans do have a nasty habit of taking what belongs to other people, if we can find a way to get away with it and rationalize it to ourselves. We tend to have even less problems with the latter part than the former, mind you. And so guards will be necessary, okay? Maybe the landowner will hire them, maybe they will be mercenaries, maybe they will be bondsmen, maybe they will become a sort of feudal knightly order but focused entirely on the defense of a certain area of land. Alternatively, the Lord and Master of the world, the Imperial Governor, could also attempt to create warrior orders artificially. As all worlds in the Imperium need to pay the Imperial tithes, feudal worlds included, manpower becomes one of the most valuable assets that it can offer up. In which case, the better the manpower, the better the tithe requirements, and the better the standing of the Imperial Governor. If he can create relatively decent fighting regiments for the Imperial Guard, the prestige of the planet, and in turn the prestige of the planetary governor, will rise. They might adopt a system similar to certain other worlds, where they create a PDF of sorts, which is essentially used as a training ground for Imperial Guard recruitment, where the best and brightest and most experienced, versatile, etc. get selected for Imperial Guard service. This then can easily become the world's primary export, with foodstuff or mineral resources being a distant second or tertiary to their actual Imperial tithe. This would also benefit the local planetary governor, because if he has more actual resources with like food and mineral resources, for example, to trade with, the greater a trade hub the planet might become, allowing for a fair bit of sort of pseudo, in a kind of way, private enterprise. It's just that the private enterprise will almost entirely be owned by the planetary governor, then able to sell his wares and produce to other worlds in the nearby area. There are planets that have grown quite wealthy and powerful by doing this. Entire dynasties have been created on the backs of the humble wheat farm, after all. There are also those planets, as briefly mentioned earlier, that provide fighting men to the Adeptus Astartes, as feudal worlds are rarely particularly pleasant places to live. Oh sure, it's no Forge world or Hive planet, but nevertheless, living at a constant Iron Age level of technology is hardly the gentlest lifestyle available in the Imperium, far from the worst, but also far from the best. And there are also, of course, feudal worlds which are not kept in that state of technology, but rather cannot advance beyond it due to some sort of overwhelming natural threat. Caliban, with the Calibanite lions and many monsters, a death world, is one of these examples. But a more standard example of an Astartes recruiting world, which is feudal, might be Calderis, which is one of the Blood Ravens recruiting worlds. Yes, the bloody magpies themselves, who behave befitting their reputation, as in most cases when Astartes establish a recruiting world, they also create a permanent presence on the world, and usually some sort of rite or ritual of recruitment, like a trial, for example, like they do on Ultramar and in the realms of Macragge, or a yearly festival of combat, or some sort of test to weed the wheat out from the chaff, etc. Whereas the Blood Ravens, they don't really do any of this. Occasionally they'll just show up on one of their recruiting worlds. It could be a decade, it could be 2, it could be 3, it could be centuries potentially. But one day, they'll arrive. They'll dock with the Imperial Planetary Governor's orbiting palace. Incidentally, in many cases of feudal worlds, the Planetary Governor does not live on the planet, because that would mean living amongst the filthy, dirty peasantry. We wouldn't want that. But rather, they often have entire floating space palaces in orbit over the world, as is the case with Calderis. Then the Blood Ravens will go, okay, so, we need to replace some losses here due to that cough. And so they do, setting up some sort of selection or screening process, ensuring that they get the best, the boldest, and the brightest of the planet's young male population. Considering the Blood Ravens, they probably set up some sort of psychic screening in all due likelihood. Then they gather up those they've chosen, and they depart again. Simple as. Though future recruitment efforts might be complicated a wee bit by the fact that Calderis is, getting overrun by orcs at the moment. Which will lead us on to yet another question. How do feudal worlds resist outside invasion? Because, as we mentioned earlier, it's all well and good to have a low-technology world, so that other imperial worlds that may rely upon its produce can easily subdue it in case of heresy. Alright, makes a certain degree of sense. An imperial degree of sense, but still, it does make a certain degree of sense. But what happens if the planet is not threatened from an internal threat, but rather from external enemies? What if a Chaos Warband wanders by? Or a group of Dark Eldar? Or, well, as in this case, the Orcs? Well, 9 times out of 10, what happens is that the planet is swiftly lost from Imperial control, or exposed to some sort of apocalyptic genocide. Like what happened to the feudal world of Acreage, for example, when a rogue psyker and a band of pirates incinerated an entire mountainside cathedral, killing God only knows how many tens of thousands of pilgrims and clergymen, including several high-ranking officials from the Adeptus Ministorum as well. Against these kinds of aggressions, a feudal world is honestly, most of the time, completely helpless. Not that it's entirely undefended, mind you. No planet in the Imperium can be entirely undefended, or if it very swiftly find itself to not be a planet anymore. And there will be some form of local planetary defense force, albeit usually very small. Now, there are multiple possibilities here. There could be a larger scale planetary defense force organized on the level of, well, a feudal militia / army, essentially. On worlds that are a bit beyond the Middle Ages, you might see things like basic firearms, single-shot autoguns, for example, in which case they could theoretically see off a low-tech opponent. Say if the orcs crashed nearby. Well, orcs tend to degrade to certain levels if deprived of specialists. We know, for example, that there are entire worlds where the orcs are, well, feudal in their own regards, riding around on battle pigs and half-formed bikes, using single-shot weaponry, clubs, and whatever else they can get their hands on. They might actually be at roughly the same technological level as the civilian populace upon arrival, presuming enough of their specialists die during the impact on the planet. They might also be able to fight off simple raiders because their numbers are going to be very, very small. Alternatively, the Lord might also maintain a standing guard of sorts, which will be brought into his personal retinue of the planetary governor, forming a more traditional planetary defense force along the lines of regular PDFs, meaning they're probably going to have stuff like autoguns, heavy stubbers, a few heavy weapons like missile launchers and stuff like that, but they're going to have very little in the way of truly advanced and coordination equipment. Vox speed, for example, will probably be unheard of. Vox casters, at best, in many cases not even on the squad level, but perhaps the platoon or even company level. Las guns are going to be rare, although they are probably going to be in some sort of presence, maybe on the Imperial Governor's personal guards, for example, or elite formations within the PDF. Now, this too does vary depending upon the resources of the world and how exposed it is. A planet that is expecting to be raided more often is, unsurprisingly, going to be a lot more prepared to get raided than one that is simply a backwater world. Some of these feudal worlds could construct entire systems of fortifications on the planet, for example. This would likely be more the case on planets that are either considered important in and of themselves, or planets that have something important to defend. Attila, for example, is a famous recruiting world, and is going to have a decent set of on-planet defenses to see off any casual raider. A Agri feudal world is probably not going to have overmuch in the defenses, because at the end of the day, food is important, but it's hardly the most important thing. A feudal world that makes its living involving mining raw resources of a particularly high grade or used in particularly vital weaponry like plasma firing rings, for example, those installations will almost certainly be guarded. And if the planet is playing host to, say, a Adeptus Mechanicus exploration team, investigating local ruins, or perhaps exploiting aforementioned mineral goods, they too will probably bring along their own defenses and fortifications. In other cases, the Imperial Governor might even create a large-scale planetary defense force which is essentially separated away from the populace, where they might have some sort of warrior trial to select good fighters and then introduce them into the PDF. They might even keep the best and brightest for themselves rather than passing them on to the Imperial Guard. This is often a tradition developed on worlds that tend to have more complicated local conditions, shall we say. The Imperium doesn't really care if a planet is currently engaged in a civil war or anything, so long as that civil war doesn't interfere with the Imperial tithes. So long as the Imperium gets its slice of the cake, it doesn't really bother over much whether Warlord A or B or C is actually in charge of the planet, leaving a great deal of leeway for local lords with ambitions to try and seize greater territories or influence for themselves, in whatever local system. Especially on a feudal world where the hierarchy is rather strict. You tend to end up with some sort of noble upper class who tend to develop ambitions beyond their stations. And sometimes these lofty hopes can even encompass the Imperial governorship itself. Now, armed insurrections are rare, and even rarer successful, as the local nobles, no matter how much support they might gather, will be equipped with the rough equivalent of sticks and stones versus laser rifles and atomic bombs. An uneven distribution of force, I'm sure you will agree. But there is, of course, one way to kind of go over the Imperial Governor's head, and that is the Imperial Tithe, which we just talked about. There have been cases of feudal lords essentially attempting to outbid the Imperial Governor by offering up even larger tithes to Imperial Tithe collectors and going, look here, look at what I can do. I'm clearly a much better candidate than the local governor. I can raise way more with way less. There have even been sustained campaigns of increased tithes from countless local noble lords in the hope of gaining the Imperium's support. Indeed, entire civil wars have essentially been fought in this way, with competing factions providing greater and greater bounties to the Imperium in the hope of the Imperium stepping in and going, we like that guy, he pays more taxes than the other guy, and essentially thereby settling the entire conflict, as whomever is recognized by the Imperium can pick up the big red phone and call for a little bit of military aid. In other instances, civil wars might even be, well, actually encouraged, which doesn't seem like a very sensible policy, really, but think about it. What is the reason why Europe today is the powerhouse that it is internationally? Well, we were actually lagging far behind China in terms of technological inventions for a very long time. We didn't have the massive open areas or the raw resources of America, nor did we have the enormous areas of Africa. Europe's a relatively small place, and that is one of the reasons why we grew to be the powerhouse we did. Because we were constantly beating the shit out of each other with anything and everything we could get our goddamn hands on. As it turns out, near constant warfare does indeed spur on a fair bit of technological inventions. And, of course, the birth of ever greater warriors and ever greater means with which of these warriors can bludgeon each other to death with. An example of this is Mancora. It is a feudal world, and I believe also a knightly world, if memory serves, which also is the main recruiting world and the home world for the Howling Griffins Space Marine chapter. The world is kept in a constant state of conflict between the various factions, the noble lords and the knightly houses, so as to create the ultimate warriors for the Howling Griffins to recruit from amongst. As obviously this near constant state of warfare creates an incredibly martial culture, where children are raised to be warriors from a very early age, and where being warriors is the pinnacle of what one can aspire to be. It also, incidentally, whether it's related or not, creates a far higher percentage of psychers than nearly any other planet in the Imperium. Now, normally this would get the Inquisition to pop about sniffing, and I am sure they have been on multiple occasions. But the psyche population is also actively and heavily policed by the Howling Griffins themselves, who get rid of those who cannot meet service requirements, either for official sanctioned psychers, food for the Golden Throne, or, the lucky ones, to be included within the ranks of the Howling Griffins themselves, who boast a significant number of librarians, and yet their noble countenance have never once been doubted. In fact, they're one of the purer Astartes chapters, even in the eyes of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition. So, who knows? Maybe eternal warfare does have its benefit, both amongst the population's general character, experience, and martial prowess. The Howling Griffins at least seem to think so, and so Mancora is kept in this state of constant civil war, and also they are kept at a relatively feudal level, with some innovations allowed here and there, but with strident interventions from the Howling Griffins and from more ephemeral sources when required. Bear you in mind, many of these worlds are rather simple. Teachings, learnings, and the general intelligence of the population tends to be rather low, and tends to be kept rather low for ease of control. There are entire worlds, for example, that are kept feudal worlds under the command of the Adeptus Ministorum, which basically simply say, okay, well, the God Emperor is out there in space, and he's a super duper awesome guy, and I can show you all kinds of miracles to convince you that he is a super duper awesome guy. Behold, I can make water emerge from the tap. Ooh. To a feudal world, that's going to be pretty impressive. Or he can make explosions, or light that hurts in the form of las rifles, and so on and so on. It's pretty easy to convince this population that the God Emperor, who has clearly bestowed all of these powerful relics upon his chosen priests, must be a swell guy. And so they will work on and work on and work on for no other reason than because the God Emperor requires their labor, and his most favored servants informs them of this, allowing the Ministorum, in turn, to gather up all of the foodstuff or other produce that the populace produces and ship it off to export market, where they will earn a pricely sum, and the locals will never have even the faintest clue as to what's going on. This obviously makes the planet easier to control, and maintaining a relatively low level of technology, with the exceptions absolutely required for increased productivity when and where seen as decent and feasible, does indeed result in a far more quiescent population. Incidentally, a tactic that we seem to be employing in the modern-day world as well, but details. Many of these worlds probably won't even have a concept of economy in many cases. Now, in many cases, most cases indeed, there is going to be some form of local currency, as the Imperium doesn't really have overarching currency. Now, sectors or larger expanses or areas might have their currencies. Thrones, for example, is a common one. But a planet like this, kept under the close scrutiny of a force that seems magical, well, at best, they are going to have some form of locally minted currency. But in many cases, this will obviously not be worth anything anywhere else, and even this amount of freedom might be denied to them, as it might encourage a little bit too much in the way of independent mindsets. seeing as, in cases of certain feudal worlds, the population is little more than a vast collection of slave labor, albeit on a galactic scale. That's an interesting question, really. How would you define a slave in these circumstances? If you have a person who genuinely believes that he is laboring in the name of the God Emperor, and he is, in a way, and can't really affect the rest of the world, but nor does the rest of the world affect him, and by the world I mean the Imperium and the galaxy at large, but he is constantly being exploited for his labor by a group of priests or nobles who take all of that he produces and sell it to the highest bidder in a galaxy, in a universe, in a market that the peasant could never even imagine and has no idea whatsoever even exists. Is that slavery? Huh. That's an interesting question, actually. And I think I will wrap up with that question, as I have told you just about everything there is to be told about feudal worlds. So, until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.